Some moments in life are so sharply defined, so utterly unexpected, that they slice through the ordinary and leave an indelible mark. This is a story about one such moment. A quiet afternoon in a gleaming corporate office where a young woman's courage shone brighter than any boardroom light, exposing a hidden truth that made a powerful man's smile crumble. After listening to the whole story, you will definitely share your opinion in the comments. So let's move towards the story. The air in the executive boardroom was thick with an almost palpable tension, yet outwardly, it was a tableau of practiced corporate composure. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the sterile perfection of the room. At the head of the polished mahogany table sat Mr. Harrison Thorne, CEO of Thorne Innovations, a man whose reputation for shrewd deals and a perpetually smooth demeanor preceded him. Today, his smile was particularly wide, almost paternal, as he addressed the small group of bright, hopeful interns gathered before him. Among them was Sarah, a young black woman with eyes that held both an eager intelligence and a quiet determination. She had navigated the labyrinthine corporate landscape of the internship with grace, her keen intellect and unwavering work ethic consistently impressing everyone she encountered. Today was the culmination, the moment they would be presented with their potential full-time employment contracts. The atmosphere hummed with anticipation, a collective holding of breath as the future beckoned. Mr. Thorne began to speak, his voice a rich baritone, weaving a narrative of opportunity, growth, and the bright future that awaited them at Thorne Innovations. He spoke of shared values, of a company built on integrity and mutual respect, all the while gesturing expansively with hands that wore a heavy gold watch. Each in turn received a crisp, thick packet, their proposed employment contract. A murmur of excitement rippled through the group as they began to flip through the pages, their expressions shifting from eagerness to focused concentration. Sarah, too, took her packet, the weight of it in her hands feeling significant, almost symbolic. She had worked tirelessly for this, sacrificing countless hours, pushing through moments of self-doubt, all for the chance to launch her career at a company she genuinely admired. Her fingers traced the elegant font of the first few clauses, a sense of quiet triumph swelling within her. But as she delved deeper, past the standard clauses about salary, benefits, and job responsibilities, a subtle shift occurred in her posture. Her brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. Her eyes, usually quick to scan, slowed their pace, meticulously dissecting each word, each line. There was a particular section, tucked away near the end, that began to prickle at her intuition. It wasn't immediately obvious, not overtly malicious, but something about its phrasing felt off. It was a clause that dealt with intellectual property, a standard part of many corporate contracts. But this one contained language that seemed to expand the company's claim far beyond what was typical or even reasonable. It wasn't just about work created for the company. It seemed to subtly extend to any idea, any creative endeavor, any personal project, even those conceived and developed entirely on employees' own time outside of company resources. A cold knot began to form in the pit of her stomach. She reread it, then read it again, her mind racing, connecting the dots. It was a net, cast wide, designed to ensnare. It was a clause that could effectively strip an individual of their personal creative freedom, their ability to pursue side passions, or even, she realized with a growing sense of alarm, to ever truly own their own intellectual output again, should it somehow intersect with the company's broad field of work. The smiles around the table remained, the quiet rustle of pages the only sound as the other interns continued their hopeful perusal, perhaps not yet recognizing the insidious nature of the language. Mr. Thorne, watching them with his unwavering smile, occasionally interjected with encouraging remarks, reinforcing the positive narrative. He seemed to embody the very essence of corporate benevolence. Yet beneath that veneer, Sarah now felt a distinct chill. Then, a voice, clear and unwavering, cut through the quiet hum. "Excuse me, Mr. Thorne," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the rapid beat of her heart against her ribs. All eyes turned to her, a collective gasp of surprise, almost audible. The other interns looked up, their expressions a mix of curiosity and slight apprehension. Mr. Thorne's expansive smile remained fixed, but a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. He inclined his head, an invitation for her to continue. I'm having a little trouble understanding Clause 7b, she said, her finger resting on the offending paragraph. Specifically, the part about all creative works, ideas, and innovations, whether developed during or outside of working hours, that bear any potential relation to the company's current or future business interests, becoming the sole property of Thorne Innovations. She paused, letting the words hang in the air, allowing their full weight to settle. Then, her voice, though still calm, took on a sharper edge. Forgive me, but this clause is a trap. The words hung in the air, reverberating with an unexpected force. The collective intake of breath from the other interns was almost louder than the sudden, profound silence that descended upon the room. And then it happened. Mr. Thorne's smile, which had seemed so immovably plastered to his face, instantly, irrevocably faded. It wasn't a slow dissolve. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, plunging the lights behind his eyes into sudden darkness. His features, moments before so benign, now tightened, revealing a jawline that seemed to harden, a glint in his eyes that was no longer paternal but sharp, almost predatory. The transformation was startling, a stark reveal of the man beneath the polished facade. The air grew heavy, charged with the undeniable tension of confrontation. Sarah met his gaze, her own unwavering, a quiet defiance burning in her eyes. She had spoken her truth, and in doing so, had shattered the carefully constructed illusion of benevolent power. The silence stretched, pregnant with unspoken implications, as the true nature of the corporate offer, and the man presenting it, was laid bare for all to see. The silence that followed Sarah's bold declaration was not empty. It was thick with unspoken questions, with the sudden, collective realization that a comfortable facade had just been brutally torn away. Mr. Thorne's gaze, now devoid of warmth, was fixed on Sarah, a silent struggle playing out in the depths of his eyes. The other interns, previously absorbed in their individual contract reviews, now sat rigid, their attention riveted on the unfolding drama. They glanced from Sarah's resolute face to Mr. Thorne's now stony expression, a slow dawning of understanding creeping into their own features as they re-examined the very clauses they had just skimmed with eager anticipation. The polished boardroom, moments ago a symbol of future success, now felt like an arena. Mr. Thorne cleared his throat, a sound that seemed unusually loud in the stillness. When he spoke, his voice was no longer the smooth baritone of the benevolent so, but held a new, sharper edge, like granite being scraped. "Sarah," he began, his tone a carefully modulated blend of condescension and thinly veiled irritation. "I believe you're misunderstanding the purpose of this clause. It's a standard protection for the company's intellectual assets. In today's competitive landscape, innovation is paramount. We invest heavily in our people, and naturally, we need to ensure that our investments are protected." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the entire room, as if the very air was filled with Thorne Innovations' proprietary secrets. His eyes, however, never left Sarah, searching for a sign of wavering, a hint of retraction. But Sarah didn't flinch. Her voice, though quieter than his, held an undeniable conviction. "With all due respect, Mr. Thorne," she replied, her fingers still resting pointedly on the specific clause, "this goes far beyond standard protection. It states that any creative work, any idea, any innovation, even if developed entirely on personal time, outside of company resources, becomes the property of Thorne Innovations if it bears any potential relation to the company's current or future interests." That's an incredibly broad and open-ended definition. It could stifle personal growth, prevent employees from pursuing their own independent ventures, or even lay claim to a hobby project that accidentally, years down the line, touches upon something the company might eventually consider. She articulated her concerns with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, stripping away the corporate jargon and exposing the clause's true intent. Her words were not an attack, but a precise surgical dissection. A ripple of murmurs finally broke out among the other interns. They began to revisit their own contracts, their eyes now sharper, more critical. Some nodded subtly in agreement with Sarah, their faces reflecting a dawning apprehension. Others looked uncomfortable, caught between the desire to maintain a polite facade and the unsettling truth Sarah was unveiling. The atmosphere had shifted from one of hopeful expectation to one of cautious introspection. Mr. Thorne's face tightened further, a faint flush creeping up his neck. He was accustomed to deference, to unchallenged authority, and Sarah's steadfast refusal to back down was clearly an affront. He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more insidious. "Perhaps, Sarah," he said, his tone now laced with a subtle threat, "you're overthinking this. These contracts are non-negotiable. They are presented to all our full-time employees. If you have such fundamental objections, perhaps Thorne Innovations isn't the right fit for you." The implication was clear: conform or leave. It was a test, a power play designed to isolate and intimidate. He watched her, his gaze unwavering, expecting her to buckle under the pressure. But Sarah remained calm, her gaze steady, refusing to be drawn into his aggressive dance. "My objections are not fundamental to working here, Mr. Thorne," she countered, her voice retaining its measured tone. "They are fundamental to protecting individual autonomy and creative freedom. A company that truly values innovation should foster it, not seek to own every nascent thought an employee has, even outside of work. This clause suggests a lack of trust, an attempt to control more than is fair or necessary. It casts a very long shadow over the promise of opportunity you just described." She was not just questioning a clause. She was questioning the very ethos Mr. Thorne had so eloquently espoused moments before. She wasn't just defending herself. She was standing up for a principle, for the unspoken rights of every aspiring innovator in that room. The weight of her words seemed to hang in the air, challenging the very foundation of the power dynamic in the room, laying bare a stark choice between the corporate dream and personal integrity. Mr. Thorne's face, now devoid of any pretense of warmth, was a mask of simmering fury. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by an intern, and certainly not with such articulate, unyielding logic. The air in the boardroom crackled with a silent, intense energy. The other interns, though silent, were no longer passive observers. Their gazes darted between Sarah and the CEO, a mixture of awe, fear, and nascent understanding reflected in their eyes. They had started to flip back through their own contracts, their fingers tracing the lines of the infamous Clause 7B, their expressions mirroring Sarah's initial alarm. A few exchanged nervous glances, a silent recognition of the trap Sarah had so courageously identified. "Sarah," Mr. Thorne stated, his voice dangerously quiet, each word precisely enunciated, "Thorne Innovations is a leader in its field. We have a reputation to uphold, innovations to protect. This clause ensures that our competitors cannot benefit from the genius developed within our walls, even if that genius stems from an idea you happen to doodle on a napkin at home. It's about securing our future, and by extension, the future of everyone who works here." He attempted to frame it as a collective benefit, a necessary evil for the greater good of the company. It was a classic corporate deflection, aiming to shift the focus from individual rights to collective security. But Sarah was not swayed by the rhetoric. She knew the difference between protecting proprietary information and outright ownership of an individual's entire creative life. "With respect, Mr. Thorne," she responded, her voice unwavering, "a company's future should be built on trust and mutual respect, not on casting such a wide net of control. If an employee develops something truly groundbreaking on their own time, with their own resources, completely unrelated to their job duties, this clause still gives Thorne Innovations the right to claim it. That's not protection. That's appropriation." It fundamentally discourages independent thought and innovation outside the confines of the company. Why would anyone risk investing their personal time and talent into a project if it could be taken from them without fair compensation or even acknowledgement? Her questions hung in the air, sharp and unanswerable without revealing the true, less benevolent intentions behind the clause. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Mr. Thorne's eyes narrowed, a cold, calculating gleam in their depths. He clearly hadn't anticipated such a direct and sustained challenge. He was used to nodding heads and easy agreements, especially from young hopefuls eager to prove their worth. Sarah, however, was proving her worth not by capitulating, but by standing firm on principle. The silence stretched, long and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the faint whir of the air conditioning. It was a battle of wills, a quiet struggle between unchecked power and unwavering integrity. Suddenly, a voice from the other side of the table tentatively broke the silence. "Actually, Mr. Thorne," another intern, a young man named Daniel, spoke up, his voice a little shaky but gaining strength as he continued. "Sarah does have a point. I've seen similar clauses, but none quite this comprehensive. It does seem to overreach." His intervention, though hesitant, was a significant moment. It was the first crack in the united front of silence, the first sign that Sarah's courage was contagious. A few more heads nodded, a growing number of interns now looking at their contracts with genuine concern, their faces no longer reflecting just ambition, but a dawning sense of unease. Mr. Thorne's gaze snapped to Daniel, then swept across the other interns. His jaw tightened further, the mask of controlled irritation beginning to slip, revealing a flash of genuine anger. The polite corporate demeanor was fraying at the edges. He realized, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that Sarah's defiance was not an isolated incident, but a ripple effect, threatening to expose the true nature of his carefully constructed offer to everyone in the room. The power dynamic, moments before so firmly in his control, was now shifting subtly but irrevocably. He had to regain control, and quickly. The silence that had once been his weapon was now his enemy, amplifying Sarah's unwavering voice and the growing disquiet among the hopeful recruits. The atmosphere in the boardroom was no longer merely tense. It was electric, charged with the palpable friction between principle and power. Mr. Thorne, his face now a mottled red, abandoned all pretense of corporate polish. The benevolent CEO had vanished, replaced by a man whose authority was being openly questioned, perhaps for the first time in a very long time. He glared at Sarah, then at Daniel, and then swept his gaze across the other interns, who now, almost uniformly, seemed to be scrutinizing their contracts with newfound suspicion. His carefully constructed illusion of generosity and opportunity was crumbling before his very eyes. "This is not a negotiation, young lady," Mr. Thorne finally boomed, his voice losing its controlled modulation and taking on a harsh, authoritarian edge. "These are the terms of employment at Thorne Innovations. They are universal, and they have been accepted by every employee who has ever joined us. If you are unwilling to accept them, then perhaps you are not the right fit for this company, regardless of your internship performance." It was a direct ultimatum, a clear attempt to shut down the discussion and reassert his dominance through intimidation. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, an unmistakable challenge in his posture. He expected Sarah to finally back down, to be cowed by the weight of his position and the unspoken threat of a lost opportunity. But Sarah, though feeling the immense pressure, refused to yield. Her voice, remarkably, remained calm, though a fire now burned in her eyes. "Mr. Thorne," she replied, her words cutting through the tension with quiet precision, "I understand that these are your terms. But a contract, by its very nature, implies mutual agreement. When a clause is so broad that it could potentially dispossess an individual of their personal intellectual property, even if developed entirely independently, it ceases to be a fair agreement and becomes an imposition. It is a fundamental question of ethical practice. If Thorne Innovations truly values the innovative spirit, It should encourage it, not seek to own it wholesale, even when it blossoms outside the company's direct cultivation. She wasn't just debating the clause. She was challenging the ethical core of the company itself. Her words struck a chord. Across the table, a few more interns shifted, their discomfort evident. One young woman, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the meeting, put her pen down and looked directly at Mr. Thorne, her expression unreadable. The room was no longer just about Sarah. It had become about a collective awakening to the terms they were being asked to accept. The silence that followed Sarah's statement was different this time. It was not merely tense, but reflective, pregnant with the quiet decision-making of the interns. They were weighing their aspirations against their principles, the allure of a coveted job against the unsettling implications of an ethically dubious clause. Mr. Thorne, sensing the shift in the room, the collective questioning of his authority, finally lost his composure. He slammed his hand on the table, the sharp crack echoing through the suddenly silent room. "Enough!" he bellowed, his face now truly contorted with rage. "This discussion is over. Sign the contracts or don't. The choice is yours. But let there be no mistake, this clause stands. And if you choose not to sign, there are countless others waiting for this opportunity." He was no longer negotiating or explaining. He was simply dictating, his thinly veiled threats now exposed for all to see. The veneer had completely shattered, revealing the raw, unyielding power that lay beneath. Sarah looked at the contract, then back at Mr. Thorne's furious face. The dream of working for Thorne Innovations, a dream she had nurtured for months, was still enticing. But the price, she now realized, was far too high. It was not just about signing a piece of paper. It was about signing away a piece of herself, her future creative freedom, her very autonomy. Her gaze hardened. The room held its breath, waiting for her decision, a decision that would not only define her future, but potentially influence the choices of every other aspiring professional in that room. The silence that descended upon the boardroom after Mr. Thorne's thunderous declaration was not one of defeat, but of profound deliberation. Sarah, though feeling the immense pressure of his towering presence and seething gaze, found a strange calm settle over her. The path ahead, the tempting offer of a corporate career at Thorne Innovations, now felt less like a dream and more like a gilded cage. She saw, with stark clarity, that accepting the contract meant more than just a job. It meant a silent capitulation of her creative autonomy, a voluntary surrender of a fundamental part of herself. She looked at the contract, its crisp pages now seeming less inviting and more like a legal snare. Her mind replayed the careful wording of Clause 7b, the insidious breadth of its claim. She imagined a future where every personal sketch, every late-night idea, every creative spark, no matter how unrelated to her daily tasks, could be suddenly claimed by the company. The thought sent a chill down her spine. The initial glow of ambition, the months of hard work, the very desire to succeed, began to dim in the face of this ethical dilemma. Mr. Thorne, still standing, his hands planted firmly on the table, watched her like a hawk, expecting her to crack, to show a flicker of weakness or regret. He had witnessed countless young aspirants wilt under far less pressure. He believed, with an almost arrogant certainty, that the allure of a prestigious job, especially to someone from Sarah's background, would ultimately triumph over any abstract notion of personal freedom. He simply waited, his face a mask of stern impatience, for her to reach for the pen and sign. But Sarah did not reach for the pen. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate breath, her gaze meeting Mr. Thorne's directly. There was no anger in her eyes, but an unwavering resolve. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the heavy silence. "I understand your perspective, and I appreciate the offer. However, I cannot sign this contract as it stands." Her words, though calm, struck the air with the force of a bell. The other interns, who had been holding their breaths, exhaled a collective, hushed sound. Mr. Thorne's expression, previously rigid, now flickered with genuine surprise, quickly morphing back into cold irritation. And why not? Pray tell. He bit out, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Are you suggesting Thorn Innovations, a leader in its field, is acting unethically? The challenge was direct, designed to corner her, to force her into an impossible accusation. Sarah, however, refused to be provoked. Her voice remained even, devoid of emotional charge. I'm simply stating that Clause 7b, as written, is too broad, too encompassing. It extends the company's claim to personal intellectual property far beyond what is standard or fair. It suggests an ownership over an employee's entire creative output, even outside of company time or resources. That, to me, represents a fundamental imbalance and a significant ethical concern. She articulated her reasoning with a clarity and conviction that disarmed his sarcasm, stripping away his attempts to belittle her argument. Her refusal was not impulsive. It was deeply considered, rooted in principle. The air in the room, already thick with tension, now felt heavy with the weight of consequence. Mr. Thorne's face was now a dangerous shade of crimson. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle twitched visibly in his cheek. He was a man unaccustomed to having his authority or his company's practices questioned, especially not by a young intern. The benevolent facade had completely crumbled, replaced by an exposed, raw fury. He leaned over the table, his voice a low, menacing growl that nevertheless carried to every corner of the silent room. You speak of ethics, miss, he sneered, his eyes narrowed into slits, while standing on the precipice of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Do you truly believe that your individual principles are more valuable than a stable, lucrative career at the forefront of innovation?